The underground market reeked of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the acrid bite of burning ozone from overused plasma generators. The stale, humid air clung to Paul's skin as he wove through the throngs of traders, mercenaries, and slavers, his every step measured, his expression carefully neutral. He had been here before, too many times. Black market auctions like these were where the worst of the galaxy's filth congregated, where flesh was bought and sold alongside stolen weapons, illegal cybernetics, and contraband spice. Paul had seen slaves in every state imaginable, terrified, broken, drugged into compliance. But this one was different. She stood on the auction block with her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, emerald green skin gleaming under the flickering neon lights. Long white hair cascaded down her back, swaying slightly as she shifted her weight. She had no chains binding her ankles, but she might as well have been made of steel for how unmovable she looked. Even bruised, even surrounded by filth, she carried herself like a queen. Paul felt his gut tighten. This wasn't the plan. He had spent the last 3 months embedded within the slaver network, carefully gathering intelligence, mapping out trade routes and identifying key players. The Federation was waiting for his signal to launch a raid and wipe this entire operation off the map. But if he blew his cover now, if he made a move before everything was in place. A slight brush against his shoulder broke his train of thought. Paul tensed, his instincts flaring as a hooded figure slipped past him in the crowd. He turned, just in time to see a gloved hand flicker toward his belt. Shit. Reflex took over. He caught the thief's wrist mid-made matter, twisting just enough to send them stumbling back. The figure hissed, yanking their arm free before melting back into the crowd. But it was too late. A sharp, predatory silence had settled over the immediate area. Paul glanced up, just as the auctioneer's voice slithered through the air. "Gives me a bunchy 200 credits, a bold start. Any challengers?" Paul's blood ran cold. No. His stomach twisted as he replayed the last few seconds in his mind. The thief, the sudden movement, his instinctive reaction, hand jerking slightly, just enough to be misinterpreted as a bid. He hadn't meant to raise his hand. The murmurs spread through the gathered crowd, a dozen alien eyes swiveling toward him with newfound interest. He felt the weight of their stares, some curious, others amused. A voice called from the back, gravelly, guttural, 300. Paul's jaw clenched. If he backed out now, if he tried to correct the mistake, it would draw attention. The slavers might suspect he was an outsider, a spy, and that would unravel everything. But if he played along, if he let this ridiculous bid ride, he could at least extract himself before... The auctioneer grinned, mandibles clicking. "Our generous guest. Will he respond?" Paul exhaled slowly. Then, with a sharp nod, he said, 500. A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. The rival bidder, a bloated, slug-like creature with 6 beady eyes, turned to examine him. Paul could see the calculation happening behind those glistening orbs. He had just driven the price high enough to make the purchase less appealing, but not so high that it seemed unnatural. For a tense second, the alien seemed to consider raising the bid again. Then, with a dismissive wave of its gelatinous limb, it conceded. Paul barely had time to process what had just happened before the auctioneer slammed the final bid marker down with a clang. So, a knot tightened in Paul's chest. 2 enforcers stepped forward, unlocking the woman's wrist restraints. She didn't hesitate. The moment the shackles fell away, she turned, stepped down from the platform, and walked straight toward him. And then, before he could react, she pressed both hands against his chest, looking up at him with those piercing silver eyes. "Husband." Paul blinked. "What?" "You have chosen me." Her voice was steady, carrying no trace of uncertainty. "I am yours now." Paul's mind blanked. She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. Before he could respond, she turned toward the gathered crowd and in a voice full of regal confidence declared, "I leave with my mate." A burst of laughter rippled through the slavers. Paul barely resisted the urge to swear. His grip on the situation, already tenuous at best, was slipping fast. If they thought he had just made an expensive purchase, that was one thing. If they thought he had claimed her in some deeper cultural way, that was something else entirely. The slavers would be watching him now. And worse, if the woman had any other ideas about this supposed bond, he had no way of knowing how far she would take it. Not good. Paul wrapped his fingers around her wrist, not harshly, but firm. "We need to go. Now." She followed without resistance, moving effortlessly at his side as they wove through the crowd. Paul kept his pace measured, his movements calm. If he ran, it would trigger suspicion. They were almost to the exit when a voice rumbled behind them. "Expensive prize you've got there." Paul didn't break stride. Not interested in conversation. A heavy hand clamped onto his shoulder. Paul moved before he thought, years of training snapping into place. He twisted, driving a sharp elbow into the slaver's gut. The brute staggered, coughing, but before he could react, she was already moving. The alien woman surged forward in a blur of motion, striking with ruthless efficiency. She pivoted, slamming a knee into the slaver's ribs, then spun, catching another guard across the jaw. Paul barely had time to register what just happened before she turned back to him, silver eyes gleaming. "We should move faster, husband." Paul exhaled sharply. "Stop calling me that." She only smirked. Then the alarms blared. Paul swore, "Run." They bolted. Blaster fire erupted behind them, searing past his shoulder. Paul yanked her behind cover, raising his own stolen weapon to return fire. She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked thrilled. And that, more than anything, sent a chill through him. This woman, whoever she was, had been playing along this entire time. Not a victim, not a damsel, not someone who needed saving. So the question wasn't why she had been sold. The question was, who the hell had managed to capture her in the first place? Paul sprinted through the docking bay, his breath tight, muscles coiled. His ship was just ahead, the Ceres, its sleek, dark hull gleaming under the flickering overhead lights. The alarms blared behind them, sharp, grating wails that signaled every slaver in the district to converge on their position. The woman ran beside him, effortlessly keeping pace. Not once did she stumble, hesitate, or look back. If anything, she looked thrilled. Paul cursed under his breath. "Move, move." A shot whizzed past his head, scorching the metal wall beside them. He grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward, weaving through the maze of crates and loading equipment. The hangar workers barely reacted, either too used to violence to care or smart enough to stay out of it. The slavers weren't far behind. He could hear them, heavy boots pounding against the metal flooring, shouts in half a dozen different languages. Paul had barely slammed the ship's hatch shut before he strode toward the cockpit, fingers flying over the controls as he prepped for takeoff. The engines hummed to life beneath his feet, vibrating through the hull like a restless beast. Outside, sirens blared and alarms flashed. The slavers were scrambling, but they were too late. By the time their security teams reached the docking bay, Paul's ship was already lifting off, thrusters burning hot as they cut through the polluted air of the market's underground city. He spared a glance at the woman beside him. She sat in the co-pilot seat as if she belonged there, silver eyes gleaming as she watched their escape unfold. She wasn't tense. She wasn't panicked. If anything, she looked amused. That was the first thing about her that set Paul on edge. The second was the way she turned to him, lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. That was exhilarating, husband. Paul clenched his jaw. "Stop calling me that." She hummed, tilting her head. "Would you prefer mate, or perhaps beloved? Your kind has so many words for it." He flicked a switch harder than necessary. "How about neither?" She only laughed, a rich, sultry sound that sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. The ship broke through the planet's upper atmosphere, stars stretching across the vast darkness beyond. The moment they hit open space, Paul engaged the jump drive. The ship lurched as reality twisted, folding around them, and then silence. The slaver world was gone. Only then did he let himself exhale. He turned to her, arms crossing over his chest. "All right, we need to talk." She stretched lazily, the movement deliberate. The dim cockpit lighting cast soft shadows over her emerald green skin, emphasizing the smooth contours of her collarbone and the faint luminescent markings running along her arms. She looked every bit the regal warrior she had appeared to be on the auction block. Except now, she was watching him with something else in her gaze. Something unsettlingly playful. "Ask your questions, husband." Paul pinched the bridge of his nose. "First of all, I didn't choose you. That was an accident." She arched a brow. "And yet, here I am, in your ship, fleeing your enemies, with your name upon my lips." Paul narrowed his eyes. "You don't even know my name." Her lips quirked. "Tell me then." He hesitated. Something about the way she said it felt like a trap, but she was watching him expectantly, waiting. "Paul." She repeated it, testing the sound. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Paul, a strong name." He refused to acknowledge the way her voice made it sound almost intimate. "Your turn," he said instead. She leaned forward slightly, silver eyes locked onto his. "Nyx." Paul studied her. The name suited her, mysterious, dangerous. "All right. Nyx. What the hell were you doing in that auction?" Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze, a calculation. "I was taken," she said simply. "By who?" "Weak men who thought chains could hold me." Paul exhaled sharply. "You didn't exactly seem helpless back there." Nyx smiled. "Did you want me to be?" He didn't dignify that with an answer. "If you were capable of escaping, why didn't you?" She leaned back as if considering. "Because I was waiting." Paul frowned. "For what?" Nyx's gaze never wavered. "For you." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Paul forced himself to move past it. "That's not an answer." She only shrugged. "Perhaps it is not one you are ready to hear." Paul gritted his teeth. This conversation was going nowhere. He pushed off the console and stood. "You can sleep in the back. There's a spare bunk." Nyx blinked. "Sleep? Already?" She tilted her head, giving him a slow, knowing look. "Are you nervous, Paul?" He leveled her with a flat stare. "Not in the slightest." She hummed, rising fluidly to her feet. Too fluidly. Paul had seen fighters move like that before, like every step was deliberate, like every shift of weight could become an attack if needed. And then she invaded his space. He didn't back away, but she was close enough now that he could feel the warmth of her body, close enough that her scent curled around him, earthy, like rain-drenched forests, but with something deeper, something dangerous. Her fingers trailed lightly over his chest plate, barely touching. "You're tense." Paul caught her wrist before she could press further. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but—" "A game?" Her lips parted slightly, amusement flickering across her face. "Oh no, Paul, this is not a game. This is a claim." His grip tightened fractionally. "I don't belong to anyone." Nyx smiled, slow and deliberate. "Not yet." Paul released her and stepped back. "The spare bunk is down the hall. Stay out of my bed." Nyx sighed dramatically. "A pity. It looks warm." Paul turned and walked away before she could say anything else. But as he reached the doorway, her voice followed him, rich with certainty. "You will come around, husband." Paul gritted his teeth and kept walking. Paul had slept through ambushes before. He had woken up in the middle of firefights, disoriented but moving, instincts taking over before his mind could catch up. But waking up to her, perched at the edge of his bed, watching him with quiet amusement, was somehow more unsettling than any battlefield. For a moment he just stared. Nick sat comfortably, legs tucked beneath her, silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. Her long white hair cascaded over her shoulders, the strands catching the glow of the ship's consoles. The faint luminescent markings along her emerald green skin pulsed softly, almost hypnotic. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Paul exhaled slowly and ran a hand down his face. "I thought I told you to stay in your own bunk." Nick smiled, tilting her head slightly. "You did." She didn't move. Paul sat up, the sheets rustling as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, putting some distance between them. "Then why are you here?" Nick's gaze followed him, unbothered by his attempt to create space. "You still do not understand." Paul clenched his jaw. He was tired, physically, mentally, emotionally. He didn't have the patience for whatever game she was playing. "What exactly am I supposed to understand, Nix?" She studied him for a long moment, then shifted closer, not enough to touch, but enough that he could feel her warmth, her presence wrapping around him like a tangible thing. "Among my people," she said, her voice softer now, more certain, "to be chosen in battle is the highest honor." Paul frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you are my bond." The words sent a slow, cold ripple down his spine. Nix's gaze never wavered. "I was taken in chains, stripped of my weapons, my honor. I had no name, no right to fight. I was nothing." She paused, her silver eyes gleaming. "Until you stood." Paul's breath caught. "You fought for me," Nix continued, her voice like a blade slipping between his ribs. "Not as a slaver, not as a master, but as a warrior. You saw me, and you chose me." She reached up, tracing the faint, luminescent lines along her arm. "Among my kind, this is unbreakable. A bond forged in battle cannot be severed. It is beyond words, beyond choice. It simply is." Paul inhaled sharply. "Nix, I didn't know." "It does not matter what you knew." Her voice was calm, absolute. "The moment you raised your hand for me, I became yours, and you mine." A slow, dangerous silence settled between them. Paul's mind raced, trying to find a way to untangle this, to argue, to explain that it was a mistake. But for the first time since they'd met, he hesitated. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't teasing. This was real to her. Paul dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "Nix, humans don't work like that. We don't just bind ourselves to people because of one moment." Nix blinked, as if he had said something ridiculous. "That is why your kind is so lost." Paul stiffened. "Excuse me?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "You fight alone. You live alone. You push away those who would stand beside you, and for what?" He opened his mouth to argue, but she kept going. "You did not hesitate when the battle came. You did not look away from me, did not leave me behind. Why, then, do you hesitate now?" Paul swallowed hard. Because she was right. Because some part of him, some stupid, buried part, had felt something when she called him hers. And that scared him more than any bounty hunter, more than any battlefield. He stood abruptly, needing to get away from this conversation before it pulled him under. "You should get some sleep. We'll be landing at a neutral station in a few hours." Nix watched him, her silver eyes gleaming. "I am patient, Paul." She smiled, slow and certain. "But you are mine, whether you accept it now or later." Paul turned and left before he did something insanely stupid. Hours later, Paul sat in the cockpit, running diagnostics on their next jump. He told himself he was focused, that his mind was clear, but every so often his thoughts drifted. To her words, to her certainty, and to the way her silver eyes saw straight through him. He was still trying to shake it off when the ship's proximity alarm blared. Paul's fingers flew over the controls, scanning for the incoming threat. A sleek, dark vessel had just dropped out of Fasprador fast, predatory, and closing in on their position. The comm crackled to life. Unidentified vessel, power down, and prepare to be boarded. Paul's grip tightened on the throttle. Nix stepped into the cockpit, her expression shifting instantly. No teasing, no amusement, just sharp, calculating focus. Who is it? Paul didn't take his eyes off the screen. Trouble. Nix's gaze flicked to him, unreadable. For you? Paul's jaw tightened. For us. The bounty hunter ship was fast, too fast. Paul's hands gripped the controls as warning lights flickered across the dashboard. The sleek black vessel on their tail had cut through their FTL wake like a blade through silk, closing in with brutal efficiency. Whoever they were, they weren't amateurs. The comm crackled again. Unidentified vessel. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Non-compliance will be met with lethal force. Paul clenched his jaw. He'd heard that line before. It was the standard greeting of hunters who didn't particularly care whether their targets were dead or alive. Nix stood beside him, her silver eyes locked onto the scanner display. Despite the tension in the air, she was calm. Paul glanced at her. I don't suppose you have any long-lost enemies I should know about. She smirked. More than I can count, husband, but I suspect this is about you. Paul didn't argue. It was possible the slavers had already put a bounty on his head for interfering with their operation, or maybe it was something worse, someone from his past coming to collect a debt he hadn't realized was due. No time to figure that out now. The targeting system blared a proximity alert. They were locking weapons. Paul slammed the throttle, sending the ship into a sharp dive. The artificial gravity groaned, struggling to compensate as they rocketed downward. The bounty ship followed, precise and relentless. A warning shot streaked past their hull, close enough to rattle the shields. Nix braced herself against the console, her voice steady. They will not stop. Paul gritted his teeth. They never do. His mind ran through his options. He couldn't outrun them, not in open space, not in a ship built for survival, not speed. But if he could force them into a disadvantage, his gaze flicked to the star charts. There, a rogue asteroid field just beyond the next gravity well. Dense, unstable, the perfect place to make a hunter rethink their pursuit. Paul adjusted their trajectory. The engines whined in protest as he pushed them to their limit, streaking toward the asteroid field. Nix watched him, her expression unreadable. You are either very brave or very reckless. Bit of both, Paul muttered. The bounty ship followed. Paul wove through the first cluster of rocks, skimming so close to the surface of a drifting mass that the ship's proximity alarms screamed in protest. The bounty hunter wasn't deterred. They stayed on him, their piloting precise. Nix exhaled sharply. They are skilled. Not skilled enough. Paul's fingers danced over the controls, rerouting power to the aft thrusters. He waited just a second longer, until the scanner blipped, confirming the hunter had fully committed to the chase. Then he cut the engines. The ship lurched as inertia took over. For a split second they were weightless, drifting dead through space. The bounty hunter had no time to react. They overshot, their trajectory carrying them forward, right into the dense field of asteroids. Paul reignited the thrusters at the last possible second, banking hard in the opposite direction. Behind them, the bounty ship swerved too late. A massive asteroid clipped their hull, sending them spinning wildly into the debris field. Paul didn't wait to see if they recovered. He gunned the engines, breaking free of the field and punching in the next set of coordinates. The ship roared into FTL, leaving their pursuers behind. Only then did he let himself breathe. Nix studied him for a long moment before letting out a soft, appreciative hum. Impressive. Paul shot her a look. You doubted me? She smirked. Not at all. I simply enjoy watching you work. Paul exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We'd just made enemies. That was a high-profile ship, which means someone with real credits wants us off the board. Nix leaned against the console, unconcerned. We will handle them when the time comes. Paul frowned. You're really not worried about this? She shrugged. I have spent my life being hunted. This is no different. That gave him pause. Paul had seen plenty of fighters in his time, mercenaries, soldiers, bounty hunters. Most of them either burned out young or drowned themselves in vices to numb the constant state of survival. But Nix, she thrived in it. She saw danger and laughed. She was bound to him now, with no guarantees of safety, no certainty about the future, and yet she was happy. That was something Paul couldn't wrap his head around. Nix must have caught the confusion on his face because she tilted her head, studying him. Then, to his surprise, she softened, not teasing, not smug, just honest. I was meant to die in chains, she said. And yet here I stand, beside a man who fought for me, who flies through the stars with me. She spread her arms slightly as if embracing the very air around her. Do you not see? This is freedom. Paul stared at her. Freedom. He had never thought of it like that. For him, freedom had always been just another word for running. Running from the Federation, from enemies, from debts unpaid. But to her, it wasn't escape. It wasn't survival. It was belonging. Paul swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like he was the one out of his depth. Nix smiled, stepping closer. One day you will understand. Paul's breath hitched as she reached up, fingers grazing his jaw. Not forceful, not a claim, just a quiet promise. Then, just as easily as she had invaded his space, she pulled away. Come, husband, let us decide our next move. Paul exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. He was in so much trouble. The ship thrummed with energy, the silence stretching between them thick with anticipation. Paul worked quickly at the controls, fingers flying over the console, rerouting power to the shields and weapons. The incoming bounty hunters weren't hesitating. They had locked onto them the moment Voss's transmission ended. Paul didn't look at Nix, but he could feel her standing beside him. Too still, too calm. When he risked a glance, she wasn't tense or anxious like most people would be in this situation. No, she was watching the scanners with a glint of amusement, as if she were eager. Paul let out a slow breath. You look way too relaxed for someone about to be outgunned. Nix smirked. They should be the ones afraid, husband. He shot her a look. 2 bounty ships, heavily armed, against us. She tilted her head, silver eyes gleaming. Yes. Paul exhaled. You're insane. Nix stepped closer, her body brushing against his as she leaned in. And yet, you like that about me. Before Paul could even think of a response, the calm crackled to life. A different voice this time, female, cold and sharp. Paul Wren, you're harboring a high-value fugitive. Surrender now and we won't turn your ship into scrap metal. Paul flicked the switch to respond. Counteroffer? How about you leave, and I won't kill you? A pause. Then a low chuckle. You always were an arrogant bastard. Paul stiffened. His grip on the controls tightened. He knew that voice. Nix's gaze flicked to him, sensing his reaction. Someone you know? Paul's jaw tensed. Used to. The woman on the other end sighed. I should have figured you wouldn't make this easy. A second later, the first blast hit. The ship lurched, shields flaring against the impact. Paul gritted his teeth, gripping the controls as the ship rattled. Nix didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing against Paul's arm. Not urgent, not panicked, just grounding. Paul exhaled, steadying himself, but the moment her touch left him, he already missed it. No time for that. He twisted the ship into a tight dive, engines burning hot as he forced their pursuers into a chase. They wanted a hunt? He'd give them one. Nix stepped away, moving toward the weapons console. Paul barely had time to process the shift before she was already scanning the targeting interface. Locking targets? Paul's fingers paused over the controls. You sure about that? Nix gave him a look. You assume I was only trained to fight with blades. He didn't argue, but damn was she full of surprises. A warning shot grazed the shields, jolting them sideways. Nix didn't hesitate. She fired. A direct hit. The first bounty ship's shields flickered violently before collapsing entirely. Paul whistled. Not bad. Nix smirked, adjusting the turret's angle. You should see what I can do with a proper weapon. The second bounty ship wasn't backing off. If anything, it was accelerating. Paul's gut twisted. They weren't trying to destroy them. They were trying to board them. Next, she was already moving. She crossed the cockpit with that same predatory grace, her fingers brushing against his back as she passed. Not an accident. Paul clenched his jaw. She disappeared down the corridor, and within seconds she returned, armed to the teeth. A sleek blaster sat snug against her hip, a plasma knife strapped to her thigh, and was that his backup pulse rifle? Paul scowled. Did you rob my armory while I wasn't looking? Nix smirked, adjusting the strap across her chest. You left it unlocked. It's fingerprint locked. She tilted her head, silver eyes gleaming. I am very good with locks. Paul didn't have time to argue. The bounty ship latched onto them, docking clamps engaging with a heavy clack. The ship's alarms wailed. Paul grabbed his sidearm, checking the charge. We've got incoming. Nix rolled her shoulders, expression turning sharp, predatory. Good. I was starting to get bored. Paul shot her a look. You really need to work on your definition of fun. She stepped closer, voice dropping to something dangerously soft. Oh, husband, I can think of many things more fun than this. Then, before he could react, she leaned in, her lips brushing his jaw, just enough for heat to coil low in his stomach. Paul's breath hitched. She grinned. And then the airlock hissed open. Blaster fire erupted. And the fight began. Blaster fire streaked through the narrow corridor, slamming into the bulkheads and sending sparks flying. Paul ducked behind a cargo crate, heart pounding as he fired off a quick retaliatory shot. The bounty hunters were fast, too fast. They had anticipated resistance, moving in tight formation, their weapons trained on every possible angle of attack. He risked a glance at Nix. She was already in motion. She moved like a shadow, fluid and unpredictable. One moment she was pressed against the wall, the next she was lunging, weaving through the blaster fire, like she had memorized the pattern before it was even fired. A bounty hunter took aim at her, but before he could pull the trigger, she was already on him. One smooth motion and her plasma knife sliced across his throat. The man choked, his weapon slipping from his fingers before he crumpled to the floor. Paul barely had time to process it before she grabbed the fallen blaster and spun, shooting another attacker square in the chest. Paul exhaled sharply. She was terrifying. Another shot whizzed past his ear, yanking him back to the present. He fired twice, hitting his mark, then moved to flank the remaining hunters. The ship shook as an explosion rocked the outer hull. A warning alert flashed red on the console. They were trying to breach the cockpit. Paul swore under his breath. They're cutting through the damn hull. Nix, we need to move. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing a discarded grenade from one of the fallen hunters, she yanked the pin with her teeth and tossed it toward the airlock. Paul's eyes widened. Are you insane? That'll blow the... The explosion detonated before he could finish, the shock wave rattling through the ship. The remaining hunters were thrown backward, their bodies hitting the walls with sickening thuds. Smoke and debris filled the air, but the breach was sealed. Nix had thrown it with such precision that the explosion had destroyed only their attackers, leaving the hull intact. Paul turned to her, half impressed, half horrified. You could have warned me. Nix smirked, blowing a strand of white hair from her face. You would have told me not to. Paul shook his head, but there wasn't time to argue. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the cockpit. We need to get out of here before reinforcements arrive. Nix didn't resist. In fact, she let him pull her closer, so close that he could feel the warmth of her against his back as they ran. His ship was a mess, alarms blaring, warning lights flashing, but the engines were still functional. That was all that mattered. Paul slid into the pilot's chair, fingers flying over the controls. Hold on to something. Nix leaned over him instead, her lips grazing the shell of his ear. I will hold on to you, husband. Paul nearly choked on air. She was doing this on purpose? With a sharp exhale, he wrenched the controls and sent the ship into a violent dive, disengaging from the bounty hunter's docking clamps. The force of the maneuver ripped them free, sending their attacker's ship spinning out of control. Nix didn't flinch. Paul grit his teeth, eyes scanning the scanner. The second bounty ship was still on their tail. Damn it, he muttered. Nix's hands slid over his shoulders, slow and deliberate. You are tense, she murmured, her lips grazing dangerously close to his neck. Paul gripped the throttle harder. Because we're about to die, Nix. She chuckled. No, we are not. Paul was about to argue when she pulled away and grabbed the co-pilot's controls. She flicked a switch. A second later, one of the ship's dorsal cannons fired, striking the bounty ship's wing at the perfect angle. The vessel veered off course, smoke pouring from the damaged thrusters. Paul blinked. Nix smirked, leaning back as she traced her fingers down his arm. You are good, husband, but I am better. Paul exhaled sharply, focusing on the navcom. We need a place to lay low, now. Nix hummed, considering. There is a system not far from here, remote, hidden. Paul narrowed his eyes. And you just happen to know a place? She smiled. I am full of surprises. Paul didn't trust it, but right now, he didn't have a better option. He punched in the coordinates. The ship lurched into FTL, leaving the wreckage behind. Silence filled the cockpit. Paul exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Nix stepped closer. Too close. He turned, about to tell her to give him space, but the words died in his throat as her hand slid over his chest. His breathing hitched. Nix, he warned. She tilted her head, silver eyes bright with something wicked. You fight so hard against me, Paul? She was too warm, too close. And after everything, the battle, the adrenaline, the near-death chase, his body ached with exhaustion, with tension, with something else entirely. Nix felt it. Her fingers traced the collar of his shirt, slow, deliberate. I told you before, she murmured, voice silk and fire. You belong to me now. Paul swallowed hard. That's not how this works. Nix's lips curved. Then show me how it works, husband. Before he could argue, she closed the distance, her lips crashing against his. Paul's brain short-circuited. Every instinct screamed at him to push her away, to regain control of the situation, But, God's help him, he kissed her back. Heat coiled in his gut, sharp and overwhelming. His hands moved before he could stop them, gripping her waist, pulling her against him. Nix let out a pleased sound, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss was war, not gentle, not hesitant, a battle neither wanted to lose. When she finally pulled back, her lips were kiss-swollen, her breath uneven. Paul was no better. Nix smirked. So, you surrender? Paul exhaled, resting his forehead against hers. You're impossible. Her fingers traced his jaw, feather-light. And you love it. Paul didn't answer, because they both knew she was right. Days passed, then weeks. For the first time since it all began, there was no one hunting them, no bounty hunters dropping out of FTL, no encrypted threats over the comms, no whispers of Kieran Voss's reach creeping closer. They were free. Paul wasn't sure when it had truly sunk in, when the tension in his shoulders had finally eased, when he had stopped waking in the middle of the night expecting alarms to blare. Maybe it was the first morning he had woken up to silence, not the hum of an impending chase. Or maybe it was now, standing at the edge of the cockpit, watching Nix laugh under the soft glow of a distant sun. She was outside, perched on the hull of the ship, her long white hair catching the golden light as she leaned back against the metal. He should have told her to be careful, that the hall wasn't meant for lounging, that one wrong step would send her tumbling into space. But she looked so at ease, so perfectly content, that he didn't have the heart to ruin it. Instead, Paul exhaled and stepped out onto the hull beside her. Nix tilted her head as he approached, silver eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "You finally joined me." Paul grunted, folding his arms. "Someone has to keep you from drifting into the void?" Nix smirked. "Ah, my ever-dutiful protector." He rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. Silence settled between them, not tense, not weighted with unspoken things like before, just comfortable. Paul stared out at the view before them, a remote system untouched by war or trade routes, planets with oceans that shimmered like liquid sapphire, moons hanging in the distance like polished pearls. It was beautiful. He couldn't remember the last time he had stopped to actually look at something like this. Nix shifted beside him, stretching like a cat basking in the warmth of a star. "You are restless," she observed. Paul huffed. "I'm used to running." Nix turned, studying him for a long moment. "You do not have to run anymore." Paul's jaw tensed. It should have been that simple, shouldn't it? No more enemies breathing down his neck, no more fights waiting in the shadows. But part of him still felt coiled, still prepared for the moment peace would slip through his fingers like it always did. Nix seemed to understand that without him saying a word. She leaned in, pressing warm lips to his jaw, soft, brief, a touch that wasn't a demand, just a reminder. Paul sighed, letting his eyes close for just a second. Nix smirked against his skin. "You will adjust, husband." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't give up, do you?" She grinned. "Never." And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to be okay with that. Days had passed since their last battle, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was peace. No warning sirens blaring through the ship, no enemy ships tailing them through deep space, no transmissions filled with threats, demands, or bounty notices. Just silence. Just them. Paul had spent so long running, fighting, surviving, that the absence of danger felt foreign. His muscles were still wired for conflict, his mind still half expecting disaster at any moment. But no alarms came, no enemies found them. They had won. He stood in the dimly lit cockpit, staring out into the abyss of space. A remote system, far beyond the usual trade routes, hidden from the reach of those who had once hunted them. No one would find them here. But that wasn't what unsettled him. It was her. Nix had changed everything. He could feel her before she even stepped into the room. Her presence, her warmth, the way the air shifted when she was near. She moved like a shadow, her bare feet silent against the cold floor, but Paul had learned to recognize her presence without needing to see her. She had a gravity to her, something undeniable, something impossible to ignore. And right now, it was all directed at him. Paul didn't turn when she stopped behind him, but he could hear the soft inhale of her breath, the subtle rustle of fabric as she leaned against the doorway. Then, a touch. Gentle, fingertips brushing over his bare shoulder, trailing down his back in an absent-minded, almost possessive motion. He exhaled through his nose. "You're quiet." Nix hummed, the sound low and indulgent. I am content. Paul glanced at her over his shoulder, his voice edged with amusement. Didn't think that was possible for you? She smiled, knowing, endlessly confident. I have all that I desire. Her fingers trailed lower, nails lightly grazing down his spine before settling at his waist. Her touch was lazy, unhurried, like she had all the time in the universe to map him. Paul stiffened just slightly, his breath slowing. Nix felt it. She stepped closer, pressing her body against his back, her arms sliding around his waist from behind. She sighed against his skin, the heat of her breath searing. You resist me, she murmured, her lips grazing the nape of his neck. Yet you let me touch you. Paul clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the console. You always have to push, don't you? Nix smiled against his skin. I push because you like it. Paul's chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths, but his fingers twitched when she dragged her lips down the curve of his shoulder. Not quite a kiss, but close enough to set his pulse hammering. Then, in a motion too smooth, too effortless, she turned him to face her. Paul let her, because of course he did. Nix tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she had already solved. You are always the one in control, aren't you? Paul swallowed hard. Her hands slid up, pressing against his chest. Slow, deliberate, possessive. Then, without hesitation, she pushed him backward. Paul stumbled. For the first time, he felt off balance. He landed against the pilot's seat, breath knocked from his lungs as Nix followed him down, straddling his lap with effortless grace. His hands instinctively gripped her hips as if on reflex. Nix smirked. Paul stared up at her, stunned. Not because she was on top of him, but because he realized he wanted her there. And Nix? She knew it. She felt it in the way his hands tightened against her thighs, in the way his chest rose sharply beneath her touch, in the way his breath shuddered when she rolled her hips down against his. Paul's vision blurred for a second. Damn her. Nix sighed, dragging her nails down his stomach, enjoying the way his muscles tensed beneath her fingertips. She leaned in slowly, letting her lips hover over his. Not yet. She wanted him to break first. Paul knew that. And yet, he was dangerously close to doing exactly that. Nix's voice dipped, rich and indulgent. You have given me many things, husband. Paul swallowed, his grip tightening against her waist. Yeah? Nix's lips ghosted over his, her breath sweet and teasing. But you have not yet given me this. Paul's resolve snapped. His hand shot up, fingers tangling into her hair as he dragged her mouth to his. Nix gasped, pleased, triumphant, so damn eager. As he finally gave in, the kiss was fire and surrender, an unspoken admission of what had been building for too long. Nix moaned against his lips, rolling her body against his, drinking in the heat, the raw hunger of him. Paul wasn't gentle. He pulled her closer, forcing her to feel the tension he had been holding back for so long. Nix loved it. She whined, nails biting into his shoulders, a silent plea for more. Paul gave it to her. Paul had never been a man who let himself fall. Not in battle, not in life, and certainly not for someone else. And yet, here he was. Nix was everywhere. The press of her body against his, the heat of her skin, the way her breath hitched as he dragged his hands down her back. She arched into him, her nails tracing fire along his shoulders, her silver eyes dark with something raw, something unchained. Paul's fingers tightened at her waist as she moved against him, slow and deliberate, teasing, testing, pushing. His pulse thundered beneath his skin, his body a live wire of tension and surrender. You take too much pleasure in this, he muttered, voice rough. Nix smirked against his jaw. nipping lightly before whispering, "Because you finally stopped running." Paul exhaled sharply, "Damn her." Her lips ghosted over his, soft but insistent, as if daring him to meet her halfway. And he did. Their mouths collided in something deep, slow, consuming, a kiss that left no room for doubt, no hesitation between them anymore. Nyx moaned into him, a pleased, sultry sound, her hands threading into his hair as she pulled him deeper. Paul let her. For the first time, he let himself want. Let himself feel everything. The way she moved against him, how perfectly she fit in his hands, the way she sighed when his lips found the curve of her throat. She was all fire and certainty, a woman who took what she wanted without hesitation. But so was he. Paul flipped their positions before she could react, pressing her down against the seat beneath them, pinning her there with his weight. Nyx gasped, her pupils blown wide, lips swollen from his kiss. "Then," she smiled. "Fine." Paul chuckled, his breath hot against her neck. "You like being hunted, don't you?" Nyx tilted her head, baring her throat to him. "Only by you." Something inside Paul snapped. He kissed her again, slow and deep, tasting the victory in her breathless sigh. Their bodies moved in sync, a slow burning rhythm of need and understanding, as if they had always been meant to fit together like this. Nyx whispered something in her native tongue, a prayer, a claim, a vow. Paul didn't know the words, but he felt them in the way she clung to him, the way she sighed his name like it belonged to her alone. And maybe, just maybe it did, because Paul was done running, and for the first time, he had someone worth staying for.